Hey there. Settle in. Dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little higher. The sort that smells faintly of soap and something nostalgic you can't quite name. Tonight's story isn't loud. It doesn't march through history with trumpets and crowns. It simply drifts the way breath does when the world is quiet. We're going back to a small English village in the mid-1800s. A place so ordinary you could pass through it without realizing you'd been anywhere at all. The roads were stitched with mud and gossip. The houses leaned a little as if tired of standing. It was the kind of village where time itself seemed to take naps. And yet, out of that plain, gray landscape came one of the strangest medical mysteries of the Victorian age. A girl who stopped being awake. Her name was Ellen Sadler. Born in 1849, ninth of 12 children. Because the Victorians believed in abundance if not nutrition, Ellen's life began in the narrow rhythm of poverty. Her father worked where there was work. Her mother, and sewed until her fingers blistered. There was church on Sunday, hunger on Monday, and an endless wind that carried the smell of coal no matter where you stood. She was quiet, mild, one of those children who seemed to absorb the world rather than speak to it. People called her sweet, which in that century meant she never caused trouble. But something about her eyes gave her away. Soft blue, yes, but always distant, like she was half listening to another conversation. When she was 11, that conversation began in earnest. It started with an illness no one could name. A cough, a fainting spell, then weeks of exhaustion. The local doctor, a man whose authority came mostly from his waistcoat, said it was nerves. Everyone had nerves back then. It was the medical equivalent of saying bad vibes. He prescribed tonics and warm milk and suggested she rest. Ellen rested, and then she kept resting. She began sleeping for hours, then days, then entire weeks. Her mother would shake her awake long enough to feed her broth or water. She would open her eyes briefly, look confused, and then slide back into darkness. The family called it a spell. The doctors called it hysteria, and the neighbors began calling her touched. By 1871, she had stopped waking up at all. Her mother sat beside the bed for days, listening for breath. The doctors came again. More of them this time. They argued over her pulse, her color, her stillness. None of them could agree on what she was. Dead? Alive? Something in between? And yet she didn't die. Weeks passed, then months. Her body remained warm, her breathing shallow but steady. The newspapers caught wind of it. Reporters arrived, sketching her likeness in charcoal. Ellen Sadler. The sleeping girl of Turville. The name stuck. The Victorians loved a spectacle, especially one that didn't bleed. People came by train, on horseback, on foot, pilgrims of curiosity. They brought trinkets, coins, even pieces of lace to leave at her bedside like offerings. Her mother allowed visitors, partly from exhaustion, partly because charity had a way of keeping hunger away. Ellen slept through all of it. Doctors from London arrived, eager to solve what the village couldn't. They brought stethoscopes, smelling salts, needles, notebooks. They examined her like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Some accused her mother of deceit, suggesting that Ellen woke at night to eat, and invited them to watch. And they did, hour after hour, candlelight flickering over her still face. No movement, no fraud. Her chest rose and fell so faintly it was easy to imagine she was a ghost rehearsing being alive. They tested her reflexes. They whispered her name. They pricked her skin. Nothing. Her body remained soft and pale, neither wasting nor reviving. The medical term was catalepsy, but the locals simply called it God's work. It was a good story, after all, a living miracle tucked away in a cottage. A saint in flannel sheets. Even the church joined the chorus. Sermons spoke of patience, of divine mysteries. The newspapers described her as sleeping in the bloom of innocence. 9 years went by like that. The world outside changed, new factories, new wars, new inventions. But inside that small room, nothing moved except the dust. Her mother aged decades in those 9 years, nursing her silently, turning her from side to side so she wouldn't stiffen like marble. People came and went, and the question always stayed the same. Is she still asleep? The answer never changed, until it did. In May of 1880, the church bells tolled 4 and Sadler. The mother who had watched over her daughter's endless night was gone. And in that same month, as if the sound had traveled into the next world and back, Ellen opened her eyes. No trumpet of awakening, no gasp of rebirth. She simply blinked and asked for tea. Her first question was, "Where's Mother?" They told her. She looked confused. Then, softly, she said, "Has she been gone long?" No one knew what to say. Ellen had been 11 when she fell asleep. She was 20 when she woke. Her hair had grown, her skin had stayed smooth, and her mind seemed untouched by time. She spoke like a child because, in her mind, she still was one. The newspapers returned, of course. Headlines shouted about miracles and fraud in equal measure. Doctors rushed back to the cottage, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl who had defied decay. They found her pale, thin, quiet, but awake. Her pulse was normal, her appetite small. When asked what she remembered, she said only, "Dreams. Dreams of bells and fields and voices that hummed just out of reach." Some said she had been in a trance. Others whispered of suspended animation, of divine preservation. The skeptics accused her mother of deception, claiming Ellen had been hidden and cared for secretly. But there was no evidence. No one had ever seen her walk, eat, or speak during those 9 years. The truth, if there was one, had vanished somewhere between sleep and myth. Ellen never fully recovered from the strangeness that defined her. She lived quietly after that. Married, had children, moved to Portsmouth, tried to live a life less remarkable. But there was always something distant about her, as if part of her mind still rested in that shadowed place she'd once called home. When people asked if she feared falling asleep again, she said, "Sometimes, I think I never woke up at all." The world eventually forgot her, of course. Fame fades faster than light. But for 9 years, an entire nation had held its breath with her. Imagine it. The slow rhythm of a girl's breathing carrying through a decade. The candles burning down. The visitors whispering prayers to a child who might never hear them. 9 years of darkness. 9 years of patience. 9 years where a single human life became a bridge between sleep and superstition. And somewhere in the silence, the line between miracle and mystery blurred completely. That's how it begins. Quietly, like the start of a long dream you're not sure you'll wake from. Would you like me to continue with the next section, where we drift deeper into what happened after Ellen's awakening? The public frenzy, the false saints, and the strange memories she claimed to bring back from her 9-year sleep? The morning Ellen woke, the village didn't know what to do with itself. For 9 years, she had been their miracle, their quiet spectacle. The strange story whispered to visitors over ale and prayer. Then, all at once, she was simply awake, blinking into the sunlight as if nothing had happened. It was a Sunday which felt right somehow. Church bells echoed across the damp fields, and the neighbors who'd grown used to silence came out to see the impossible. The news traveled faster than common sense. By afternoon, half of Turville had passed by her cottage, some to offer congratulations, others to confirm she hadn't turned to dust. People said her skin was pale as candle wax, that her eyes fluttered like she was still deciding whether to stay awake. The doctor arrived with his hat in his hands, his expression caught between relief and irritation. For years he had been the custodian of the unexplained, and now his mystery had betrayed him. He examined her carefully, checked her pulse, her pupils, her temperature. All normal. Too normal. He muttered something about hysteria resolved by shock. A phrase that sounded convincing until you realized it meant absolutely nothing. Ellen, for her part, said very little. Her voice was hoarse, her sentences short. When asked what she remembered, she said, "Dreams." The doctor pressed her for details. What kind of dreams? Did she know she was asleep? But her answers remained soft and circular, like someone speaking through fog. The neighbors didn't care for scientific explanations. They wanted wonder. They preferred to think she had been kept alive by angels, or that her mother's prayers had woven a net between her and death. Some said that when Sadler died, she had given her life back to Ellen, a quiet exchange between mother and daughter. The newspapers revived the story overnight. The Times called it a triumph of faith. Others went for drama. The resurrection of the sleeping girl, complete with woodcut portraits of a pale young woman glowing faintly in bed. The reality, of course, was far less radiant. Ellen was thin, weak, and confused. She needed help walking. She flinched at sudden noises. Imagine spending 9 years in silence and waking to find that the world had learned to shout. But the crowds came anyway. They came by train and carriage, on foot, in groups of 10 or 20. They pressed coins into her family's hands to see her, to say they had stood in the presence of the girl who'd outslept time itself. She became an attraction again, though this time she could see it happening. She smiled politely, offered thanks, and endured the endless staring. Behind closed doors, the family argued. Some thought the attention dangerous. Others said they couldn't afford to turn it away. Her mother's death had left them with debts, and the visitors were generous when moved by miracles. So Ellen sat by the window each day, wrapped in a shawl, pretending to read the Bible while strangers peered in. She said later that she didn't remember much from those visits. Only faces, blurred and distant, as though seen through water. Sometimes she felt herself drifting again, the edges of her vision darkening. She would fight it, blinking furiously, clutching the window frame. The world tilted slightly each time, like a dream trying to pull her back. Doctors from London began to arrive, armed with questions, instruments, and egos. They wanted to test her, to claim her case for their journals. They asked if they could measure her reflexes, her temperature, her heartbeat. Some proposed keeping her under observation in a hospital, which was the polite way of saying on display. The family refused. They offered money. The family still refused. For once, pride outweighed need. The doctors left muttering that the whole thing was a farce. But none could explain why, after 9 years, her body hadn't wasted away. One physician, a man who'd written 3 books and understood none of them, declared that Ellen had been sustained by the faintest respiration, akin to the dormancy of certain amphibians. Another suggested divine magnetism. Another simply said, "The human mind can trick the flesh into anything." None of it felt right. Ellen was patient with them all. She seemed detached, as though the questions were about someone else. When asked how she felt, she said, "As though I never went away." When asked if she believed she had been asleep for 9 years, she frowned and said, "I think time stopped coming." The village priest visited her regularly. He spoke to her of God's mercy, of miracles, of second chances. She listened quietly, nodded in all the right places, and said little. Later, he told a friend that he wasn't sure she believed a word of it. He described her as half here, half there, like a candle still deciding whether to burn. Weeks passed. Her strength returned slowly. She learned to walk the village lanes again, to sit in the sun, to take tea with neighbors. People stopped staring quite so much. They still whispered, but the novelty was fading. Human wonder, after all, has a short shelf life. Yet the whispers never completely stopped. Some said she still slept too deeply, that sometimes she would disappear for hours and no one could wake her. Others said they saw her standing at her mother's grave long after sunset, talking softly as though waiting for an answer. It was her eyes that unnerved people the most. They were blue, still soft, still distant. But now they carried something else, a quiet exhaustion, like someone who had seen too much nothing. The newspapers moved on to new sensations. A two-headed calf, a haunted house, a fortune-telling widow. Ellen's story slipped to the back pages, then out of print altogether. The world forgot her the way the world always does. But Ellen didn't forget. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night convinced she was still dreaming. The air in her room would feel thick, the moonlight unfamiliar. Once she asked her sister, "Do you ever wake up and feel like you shouldn't be here yet?" Her sister told her not to talk like that, said it was bad luck. Ellen only smiled and said, "Maybe luck doesn't work where I was." She lived quietly after that, no miracles, no scandals. But the story followed her like an old perfume. Every new neighbor heard it eventually. The girl who slept for 9 years, who came back untouched by time. When she married, people joked that her husband should count himself lucky. At least she wouldn't talk too much. When she had her first child, an old woman said, "I hope it doesn't inherit her dreaming." Ellen pretended not to hear. She'd learned that silence was its own armor. Years later, when asked again about the dreams, she gave a different answer. She said she remembered a garden that never changed, and a gate she wasn't allowed to open. Every time she reached for it, someone called her name, and she'd wake up crying. When they asked whose voice it was, she said she didn't know. Then she added, "It sounded kind, though. I think I'll know it again when I hear it." That was all. The girl who slept for 9 years had become a woman of quiet sentences. The world kept spinning, oblivious. But somewhere in the slow turn of history, a single breath still seemed to belong to her. A reminder that even in an age of reason, mystery never really went back to sleep. They said time heals, but time looked at Ellen and shrugged. It passed, yes. Fields sprouted, barns leaned, children learned to read. And yet she moved through it as if it were water, pushing gently, never quite breaking the surface. The neighbors relaxed. The priest stopped bringing his notebook. The doctors found new curiosities. She learned to buy bread without being stared at. Progress of a sort. But her sleep never returned to normal. Nights were a negotiation. She would lie down early, the room carefully arranged. Curtains open just enough to let the moon see she was still here. Hearth banked low so the shadows didn't stack. She'd close her eyes and feel the old tug, that slow downward drift, as if a hand beneath the bed had taken hold of her wrist. She learned to fight it with small, stubborn tricks, reciting psalms out of order, pinching her palm, counting backward from an impossible number. It helped sometimes. Other nights she slipped anyway, and morning found her with the familiar taste of iron in her mouth and a bell tone ringing somewhere in the back of her skull. She never told the family all of it. You learn, when your life becomes public property, to keep a few rooms locked. She said merely that she tired easily, that the world felt too bright, too loud. That was true, but the fuller truth was stranger. There were evenings when she would stare at a teacup and feel certain she had seen it yesterday, though she'd never owned it before. There were hours that arrived out of sequence, conversations that felt like repeats. She lived with a mild echo, as though the days spoke twice. The priest, kind, patient, and increasingly uncertain of his own sermons, visited less often but stayed longer when he did. They spoke of ordinary things. Weather, harvests, the new vicar's unfortunate insistence on long hymns. Sometimes he would circle back to the years lost and ask carefully whether she feared going back. She answered the same way each time. Fear wasn't the word. Fear had edges. This was something softer. Like standing on a riverbank, she said. Knowing the water remembers you. Her sisters helped her relearn the village. The road to the mill dipped a little more than she remembered. Mrs. Hargreaves had died and then reappeared as a niece with the same jaw. There was a new shop with gaslight in the window at dusk, a small miracle no one could stop talking about. Ellen blinked at it, the steady flame that asked for no wick, and thought how the future loved to make promises in glass. People assumed the 9 years would be the most difficult thing to live with. Turned out it was the day after that kept tripping her. The everyday business of being awake. Deciding, answering, standing still when a cart rattled by and your bones remembered lying down. She learned that hours have weight. She learned that a hand on the shoulder, meant kindly, can feel like gravity. Sometimes, without warning, the old drowsiness would pour through her and she would sit down wherever she was. On a doorstep, a fence rail, a church pew. Not sleep, not exactly. More like the body remembering to be unmade. A little boy with 2 wide eyes once asked if she was dying, and she said, as gently as she could, "No, darling. Just visiting." His mother pulled him away as if the word itself were catching. The skeptics never fully disappeared. They returned in waves, brought on by boredom, by the season that made newspapers thin. A gentleman with a stiff beard arrived one afternoon carrying a watch and the kind of smile that only appears on people who think they're about to be right. He asked permission to observe. He sat in the parlor while Ellen mended a sleeve, and every few minutes he asked if she felt drowsy. She didn't. After an hour, he pronounced her cured of a condition she'd never claimed to have and left, pleased with his diagnosis. Later, when she finally set the sleeve aside and closed her eyes for a moment, her sister laughed and said, "You should send for him. You're relapsing." Ellen smiled. "I'll send him a bill." Meals became a kind of treaty. Appetite had to be persuaded, coaxed, occasionally bribed. Broth, bread, little fishes fried crisp, apples stewed with too much clove. There was a peculiar satisfaction in chewing, proof, small and undeniable, that the machinery still turned. On bad days she would forget halfway through and find herself staring at the spoon as if it had asked a difficult question. On good days she licked jam from her thumb and thought, almost with surprise of joy. She tried work, not the relentless labor her mother had known, that lifelong duet with needle and rent, but small, useful tasks. Hemming for neighbors, keeping parish accounts when the verger's eyesight went crooked. Twice a week she read out loud to an elderly widow who liked her novels damp and sentimental. Reading aloud steadied her. The words had a rhythm like walking. If she matched her breath to the sentence, she could keep moving. Dreams, though, they remained. Not grand, instructive visions. Just the usual human nonsense with edges too crisp to ignore. The bell tone returned often, not in churches but in fields, a bright metallic hum that seemed to have lost its bell and kept its ringing. She dreamed of a garden that refused seasons, of a gate that would not unlatch, of a path that always curved left, no matter which way she thought she was walking. Once she dreamed the house full of people who were absolutely silent, and she woke with the taste of their names in her mouth, though she could not have said them if asked. She tried to confess the dreams to her eldest sister, who was practical in the way women become when life insists upon it. The sister listened, nodded, and said, "You need more meat." It was not a bad prescription. It simply treated mystery as anemia, which, to be fair, is sometimes what mystery turns out to be. On market days she found the crowd easiest to bear. There is safety in being a face among faces. The noise blurred into a tolerable wash. Pigs arguing with fate, sellers promising their apples had known sunlight personally. A fiddler insisting the tune was traditional despite having written it last night. And yet she never fully lost the sense that someone was walking just behind her, pace-matched, not sinister, simply companionable. When she turned, there was no one. She began to nod, slightly, as if to reassure the air that she'd noticed its trouble to keep up. There were letters, sometimes, not to her. People preferred to speak about her rather than to her, but to the priest, to the doctor, to the editor of a county paper who still had a soft spot for yesterday's marvels. The letters offered explanations. A woman from Leeds, laudanum poisoning. A gentleman from Bath, magnetic flux. A nun from Galway, the will of God and possibly a task yet unfinished. The priest read the best ones aloud to her and they laughed together, because laughter keeps the ground firm when other things go liquid. The nun's letter, though, Ellen asked him to read twice. A task yet unfinished. It sounded, annoyingly, like a chore. There were suitors. Of course there were. Men are not put off by legend if there is gentleness attached. One wrote a poem whose meter collapsed midway like a drunken chair. Another brought a wicker cradle he had made himself, which was both premature and optimistic. She refused them kindly. It was not that she doubted the day might arrive. It was that the world felt like a room she had not finished learning. There is no hurry to invite someone to share a room if you are still counting the windows. Winter sharpened and softened her in equal measure. Cold air clarified her skull. Long nights tempted sleep's old ambition. She learned to place a basin of water by the bed so she could taste wakefulness if needed. She learned that a cat on the feet pins you to the living world more effectively than any sermon. She learned that snow at midnight reflects enough light to make the ordinary miraculous and the miraculous ordinary. On one of those nights, she walked to the churchyard. It was not a morbid habit, merely a truthful one. She stood by her mother's stone and spoke as if the ground were an ear. Nothing dramatic, small news, whether which neighbor had taken ill and which had recovered in a way that promised gossip. At some point she said, without intending to, "I keep hearing bells." The snow made a kind sound of the world, and for half a breath she thought the air answered. Not words, exactly. Agreement. She went home lighter. There were relapses of a sort. Not 9 years. Nothing close. An afternoon taken from her. A morning that arrived with a hole in it. Once, she slept from dusk to noon and woke convinced she had missed something important. A message, a person at the door, a sentence left midair. There was nothing, of course. The world is very good at continuing without us. That is partly its cruelty and partly its mercy. The doctor, one of the more human ones, suggested that perhaps the body, having learned the path to a deeper quiet, might always keep the map. He said it gently, as though not to scare her with his own image. She liked the idea. It made sleep not an enemy but an old road at the edge of the village, useful if you knew where it led and when to turn back. She did marry eventually, to a man who understood that silence is not emptiness but a way of holding space. He was away often, the sea asking for him the way the long sleep had once asked for her. She did not begrudge it. Everyone belongs to something larger: ocean, illness, God, work, history. Marriage is merely the act of naming what you will try to share while those larger things pass through. There were children. The first one came with a look of deep, ancient insult, as if having been evicted from eternity without proper notice. Ellen held the infant and felt the bell tone for the first time turn sweet. She learned the exhausting ecstasy of sleepless nights, which is its own proof of life. The village adjusted its story about her, not abandoned it. Now she was the sleeping girl who was a mother, the marvel who could darn socks and scold and put a hand to a forehead and say, with frightening accuracy, "Fever." Years later, when someone too young to remember anything asked if she would tell the story again. The 9 years, the awakening, the tea. She obliged because kindness is a better use of breath than correction. And when they asked the inevitable why, she said what she had come to believe was the only unpretentious answer: "I do not know." Then, If they looked disappointed, she added, but I learned to stay. That was the quiet lesson threaded through the louder one. The newspapers had taught people to admire her for sleeping. She learned to admire herself for not going back. Not every hour, not entirely. Staying is not a single act but a practice, a repetition. A small daily refusal to step too far into the river even when it murmurs your name. If anyone pressed for a miracle, she would gesture. At the washing on the line, at the loaf cooling, at a child with jam on her face, at a husband's boots drying by the fire. There, she would want to say, only sometimes saying it aloud. There, I woke up into this. And if they didn't understand, well, miracles are not obliged to be impressive. Some of them are simply stubborn. At night, when the house was quiet and the cat performed its appointed duty upon her feet, she would listen. The bell tones still visited, less a summons now than a weather report. Here is the air, here is your breath, here is proof. She would close her eyes and feel the edge of the old river and think, without drama, that she could step in if she wished. Then she would roll to her side and consider the astonishing complexity of ordinary sleep. The mind's soft rummaging, the heart's uncomplaining metronome, the way morning arrives like a promise and a habit both. She would sleep and wake and spend the day making the world slightly sturdier with each small choice not to drift. And perhaps that is the only ending such a story earns. Not thunder, not trumpets, but a woman in a lamplit room, mending a cuff, pausing to rest her eyes for a moment, then opening them again because the kettle has begun to sing. Years pass the way dust settles. Slowly, invisibly, until everything is covered. The legend of the sleeping girl faded into the same gray air that softened the hills. The villagers spoke of her less, not out of cruelty, but because new stories had arrived. There were babies, wars, marriages, and crops to discuss. No one forgets out of malice. They simply run out of silence. Ellen noticed the quiet disappearance of her own fame with the same mild curiosity one might feel when a long illness stops aching. Fame, after all, was a kind of fever. She hadn't asked for it. She'd simply been the girl who lay still while the world leaned in too close. When people stopped visiting, she didn't miss their eyes. What she missed, strangely, was the sound. The hum of footsteps, the clink of teacups, the endless murmuring that had surrounded her bed for nearly a decade. Sleep had been noisier than anyone guessed. Her children grew, and the house filled with laughter. The bright, unself-conscious kind that makes even grief sit politely at the edge of the room. They didn't understand their mother's past. They thought the stories about her were fairy tales. Once, her daughter asked, "Did you really sleep for 100 years?" And Ellen smiled and said, "Almost." She didn't correct the math. At night, when the house settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, she would walk from room to room, checking each child's breath. She said it was habit, but really it was curiosity. She wanted to see what ordinary sleep looked like, the kind that ended when you wanted it to, the small miracle of morning. She never spoke of fear, but she kept a candle lit every night, a thin line of light between her and whatever waited beyond. Sometimes she sat beside it long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at the flame until her vision blurred. The old feeling would creep back then, a sense that she was drifting, that the world was a dream she was only visiting. She'd whisper the names of her children under her breath, one by one, anchoring herself to the sound of them. The priest who had once kept notes about her case had retired. The new one was young, eager, and slightly uncomfortable with miracles he couldn't measure. When he visited, he avoided her eyes, as if her calmness accused him of something. He brought pamphlets, spoke of modern medicine, and once suggested that her long sleep had been a kind of nervous retreat. She thanked him politely and said, "Perhaps," though she knew he didn't understand the word retreat the way she did. There were rumors that other sleepers had appeared elsewhere. girls in France, a man in Wales, a boy in Ireland who'd been asleep for 6 months. Newspapers connected them to her, printing her name again for the first time in years. She read the articles, folded them carefully, and tucked them into the back of a drawer. When asked about it by neighbors, she only said, "People are always tired." Her husband, Isaac, was patient in the way sailors learn to be. He'd seen storms that lasted for weeks, ships vanish overnight. He understood the quiet violence of things that couldn't be explained. When Ellen woke screaming some nights, he didn't question her. He just waited, one hand on her back, until her breathing matched his again. Sometimes she told him about the bells. The sound that had haunted her dreams for years still came and went, though softer now, like a memory calling from another room. Isaac listened and said, "The sea does that too. It remembers its own noise." The world outside their little house changed faster than dreams could catch up. Railways cut through the hills. Wires carried voices through the air. Electricity turned night into day. People spoke of progress as though it were a cure for mystery. Ellen watched it all with a faint smile. The world had spent a century learning to wake up, but she knew better than most that waking was not the same as living. When she walked through town, she saw faces lit by electric lamps. Pale, unnatural, almost dreamlike. The same glow she'd once feared in herself now filled every window. Sometimes she wondered if the world had joined her in sleep without noticing. Everyone seemed half dreaming, hurrying nowhere, forgetting why. Her eldest daughter married and moved to London. On her wedding day, Ellen stood beside her, proud and quietly envious. The church bells rang, and she felt the old pull again, the same low vibration in her bones. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was standing or drifting. She steadied herself with the smell of flowers, with the sound of laughter, with the sight of her husband's hand resting calmly on hers. Afterward, when they were alone, Isaac asked if she was all right. She said yes, then added, "The bells sound closer lately." He nodded, not asking what she meant. He had learned that some sentences were not meant to be replied to. In the years that followed, Ellen grew older in the gentle, unremarkable way of people who have already lived too much in too little time. She wasn't fragile anymore. She was weathered, like stone smoothed by rain. The villagers respected her in the quiet, superstitious way they reserve for people who have borrowed time and paid it back. Once, a young reporter came from the city, eager to write a retrospective. He brought a notebook and a camera and spoke too quickly. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked her, meaning the sleep, the fame, the miracle. She thought about it for a long time before saying, "No, but sometimes I miss the silence." He didn't understand, of course. He wrote an article about the sleeping girl who learned to dream, and it ran for a single week before being replaced by a story about a horse that could count. That night, Ellen laughed quietly and said to Isaac, "Even the horses are cleverer now." He smiled and said, "No, just louder." She never entirely escaped her story. Children born after her time still heard whispers about the girl who'd slept for 9 years. They'd dare each other to knock on her door. Some nights, she'd hear tiny fists tapping against the wood, followed by giggles fading into the dark. She never opened the door. Some myths are kinder when left unconfirmed. In her later years, she kept a small diary, nothing grand, just brief entries about weather and dreams. Most pages were empty, but scattered between them were fragments that read like poetry without trying. Dreamed of water without sound. Heard bells but no church. Woke to sunlight and the smell of apples. Felt awake but not alive. Perhaps that's enough. When her husband died, she didn't weep in public. She stood by his grave, eyes dry, hands still, and when someone asked what she was thinking, she said, "I hope he wakes gently." After that, she lived alone. The children visited, But the house grew quieter with each passing year. Sometimes, in the middle of a sentence, she would stop speaking and stare at the wall, as if listening for something. When asked, she'd shake her head and smile. Ellen Sadler, the girl who slept for 9 years, spent the rest of her life listening for the echo of a dream she had once belonged to. By the time she died in 1911, the newspapers barely noticed. A small obituary in the Portsmouth Gazette mentioned her name without flourish. But if you read it closely, you might notice a single line that stands out from the rest. She was known for her remarkable calm. Calm. The word that carried both serenity and surrender. The kind of calm that only comes from people who have already lived through the quietest apocalypse imaginable. 9 years of nothing, followed by a lifetime of everything. And somewhere, maybe in the place between waking and sleep, the bells rang once more. There are people who live by clocks, and then there are people like Ellen who move in their own weather. After 9 years outside of time, the tick and chime of it meant little to her. She could wake at dawn or in the middle of the afternoon and not feel the difference. Her body, once ruled by that vast, dark stillness, had no patience for schedules. When neighbors asked if she feared losing whole days again, she said, "No, days lose themselves." It unsettled people, that calm detachment. The village depended on rhythm. Bells marked prayer, the market marked work, the seasons marked worth. Ellen had become a small heresy against all that. Not malicious, simply indifferent. She wasn't trying to break time's spine. She had already lived where it didn't exist. She began keeping notebooks again. Not diaries exactly, more like weather logs for the interior. June 3rd. Woke with rain in my ears. July 9th. Thought I heard mother calling. It was a kettle. August 14th. Dreamt of walking, woke to bruises on my toes. The entries were sparse, factual, without commentary. Isaac had called them her evidence, which amused her. After he was gone, she kept writing, less often but more carefully, as if documenting the slow fade of something rare. The pages smelled of soot and lavender. Sometimes she'd find a dead moth between them, wings fragile as breath. The village aged too. The miller's sons took over. The smith's hammer grew quieter. Electricity came late, reluctantly. When light bulbs first hummed to life in the church, people gasped. Ellen just smiled, as if she had seen brighter light in her dreams. She said once, to no one in particular, that humans are always trying to imitate daylight. Nobody asked her what she meant. It was around that time that younger villagers began treating her like folklore. Children whispered her name at dusk, daring each other to stand by her gate. Some left flowers. Others left buttons, bits of ribbon, odd offerings as though she were a saint of sleep. She didn't mind. Sometimes she'd find them in the morning and line them on the windowsill. A small museum of misunderstanding. One autumn evening, a visitor came from Oxford, a young scholar with nervous hands. He wanted to interview her for a book on peculiar medical phenomena. He asked permission to record their conversation with a phonograph. She laughed softly and said, "You may, but I don't think the machine will believe me." He asked about her 9 years. She gave him the same answer she always had. "Dreams." He pressed, "Do you believe it was truly sleep?" "I believe it was not waking," she said. He tried to explain catalepsy, suspended metabolism, psychosomatic withdrawal. Words like fences. She let him talk until he ran out of air, then said, "You think time is a line. It isn't. It's a tide." The recording captured his nervous cough, the shuffle of paper, and her voice, quiet, unhurried. Later, when he played it back in his college rooms, he swore he heard something faint under her last sentence, like the toll of a distant bell. He blamed the cylinder, the acoustics, the wind. He wrote his book, omitted that part, and called her case unresolved. For Ellen, the real puzzle was simpler. She had slept through deaths and births, through revolutions and inventions, and she'd come back to a world that believed in measurement more than mystery. She admired its precision even as she pitied it. The world had built itself 1,000 clocks and still didn't understand time. In her notebooks, she began sketching the sky, not as constellations but as sound. Each star a note, each cloud a rest. She couldn't explain why, only that the night seemed to hum differently now, a little closer to the pitch she remembered from her long dreaming. When the wind blew through the chimney, she heard harmony. When it didn't, she hummed herself. Her children worried, of course. They said she worked too late, that the lamp burned her eyes. She told them the truth. She liked the company of darkness. It didn't ask questions. One evening, her youngest son brought her a gift. A small brass pocket watch, newly repaired. He said it would keep her steady, help her keep track of things. She thanked him, turned it over in her hands, and listened. The tick was clean, precise, arrogant. She put it on the table beside her bed and never wound it. Every night it sat there, hands frozen at 11:43. It became a joke between them, mother's hour. When he asked why that time, she said, "Because it was the last hour I remember." It wasn't true. She remembered the moment after, the faint chime of bells before the world went away. But the boy didn't need that part. Winter thickened, the kind that turned roofs into muffled hills. Ellen felt it in her joints, the slow stiffening that comes for everyone eventually. Her dreams turned stranger. Landscapes made of breath, her mother walking ahead carrying a candle that never dripped. Sometimes she woke with the taste of metal in her mouth, the echo of her own heartbeat lagging by a beat. She took to sleeping upright, half afraid of lying too flat, half curious to see if posture made any difference to whatever place waited between. The doctor, the same one who had once compared her to amphibians, was long gone, replaced by a younger man who liked to visit not as physician but as conversationalist. He brought her tea and new gossip. He was fascinated by the notebooks, the sketches of sound. He asked if he could take them when she was gone, for posterity. She smiled and said, "Posterity doesn't know how to read me." Sometimes, when snow fell, she imagined she was watching sleep itself descend. White, gentle, unstoppable. She'd sit by the window, the frozen watch beside her, and think about all the lives that had rushed past her while she drifted in darkness. 9 years, then a lifetime, both equally improbable. On her 61st birthday, her daughter brought a cake and a gramophone record of music Ellen had never heard before. A waltz, light as glass. The melody shimmered, lifted, spun. Ellen laughed. "It sounds like people who've never been tired," she said. When the record ended, she asked them to play it again. Halfway through the second time, she closed her eyes, not from weariness but to listen better. She never told them what she heard under the waltz, the faint ring of those old bells, the ones from her dreams, perfectly in key. They asked if she liked the song. "Yes," she said. "It remembers something I forgot." By then, she had accepted that memory and dream were made of the same fabric. Thin, transparent, impossible to fold neatly. The world thought she had been asleep once and awake forever after. She knew better. Waking and sleeping were only the same motion scene from opposite shores. If there was a lesson in her long history, she didn't write it down. She just kept living it quietly. Waking up, making tea, feeling the tide of hours roll in and out around her. Each day another small act of staying. And when she looked at the frozen watch beside her bed, she felt no urge to wind it. Time, after all, had already been generous. By the turn of the century, the world had become louder than she could ever have imagined. The streets outside her window trembled with the hum of motor cars, the chatter of radios, the clatter of shoes on pavement. It was an age that worshipped motion. People rushed from one hour to the next as if time were a thing they might lose if they didn't chase it hard enough. Ellen often sat by the window and watched them pass. The younger ones laughed at invisible jokes, their mouths wide and bright. The older ones hurried with that particular tension of people pretending not to be afraid. None of them seemed to notice the rhythm of their own breathing, or how the sun fell across the same cobblestones each morning. They called it progress. She thought of it as noise. Her own world had grown smaller, trimmed to fit the slow pulse of her remaining days. The rooms had narrowed around her like an embrace that knew when to stop squeezing. The brass watch on the bedside table still rested at 11:43, the hour she had claimed for herself. The frozen hands gleamed faintly in the half-light. Every so often a visitor would pick it up and wind it out of habit, and she would let it run until it stuttered and died again, the tick swallowed by quiet. Her children came and went with stories of their own households. She listened, smiling at the right places. She had learned to love vicariously, to feel pride and sorrow in the same steady exhale. Her grandchildren were less patient. They wanted tales. They would climb onto the edge of her bed and demand the story they already knew, and she would tell it anyway. "Yes, I slept," she would begin, her tone as mild as weather. The world went away and came back different. They asked what she dreamed of, and she would give them fragments. Snow that never melted, bells that didn't stop. She never mentioned the loneliness of it, the way even dreams can echo when they last too long. Some truths belong only to the tired. Occasionally, strangers still found their way to her door. They came with notebooks, with cameras, with too much curiosity. They wanted to see the miracle woman, the remnant of an age before science had grown arrogant. Ellen treated them kindly. She made tea, she answered their questions, and she let them leave thinking they had learned something. One young woman came from London, a writer, earnest and pale. She asked if Ellen regretted waking up. Ellen thought about that for a long time, long enough for the kettle to whistle dry. Finally she said, "No, I regret that waking doesn't last." The writer wrote that down as if it were wisdom, and maybe it was. When they left, Ellen took to walking the garden in the late afternoons. The soil was thin, stubborn, but it managed a few flowers, violets mostly small and blue like fragments of the sky. She liked their modesty. You had to bend low to see them. Some days she would lose track of time among them, hands in the dirt, humming the old waltz her children had played for her years before. The dreams changed again. They were no longer full of bells or fields. Now they were quiet and oddly domestic. Rooms she didn't recognize, people she half knew, laughter in another language. She began to think of sleep not as absence but as rehearsal. Every night was a little practice for the great vanishing everyone owes. One evening she sat at the table with a cup of tea gone cold and tried to write a letter she wouldn't send. It began simply, "To whoever finds this, do not make me larger than I was." She stopped there, realizing she had already lost that argument. She folded the paper and tucked it into one of her notebooks anyway, between the pages where she had drawn the stars as notes. A mild illness found her that winter. Nothing dramatic, just a slow failing of breath and appetite. The doctor, older now himself, came and left prescriptions she didn't use. She told her daughter she was fine, that she was simply tired of staying up. The night before she died, she asked to have the candle placed near the window. The flame bent in the draught, thin and patient. She watched it for a long time, the way you watch a friend packing for a long journey. Her daughter sat beside her, reading aloud until the words blurred into rhythm. Sometime before dawn, the daughter dozed off in the chair. She woke to silence, not the frightened kind, but the deep, settled quiet of something completed. Ellen's head had turned slightly toward the window. Her eyes were closed, her mouth softened by the faintest trace of a smile. The candle had burned down to a small, steady bead of light. The funeral was small. The priest, who had once been the curious young man she tolerated, spoke gently. He said she had taught the village patience. He said she had been a reminder that stillness, too, was a form of courage. The words were kind and mostly true. Afterward, her children sorted through her things. They found the notebooks, the frozen watch, the half-written letter. They kept them without reading too closely. Some objects, they understood, should be allowed to keep their own secrets. Years later, when someone mentioned the name Ellen Sadler, it no longer belonged to the woman. It belonged to the story, the girl who had slept for 9 years, the miracle, the mystery. The real Ellen, who had lived an ordinary, patient life afterward, faded into legend's shadow. But the legend never really lied. It had always been about endurance, about the strange grace of being quiet while the world spins itself into exhaustion. And somewhere in that truth, Ellen still lingered, not as a ghost, not as a saint, but as the idea that sometimes the most remarkable thing a person can do is to wake up once and keep doing it. If you walk through Turville now, you'll find nothing left of her but the echo of a name on old paper, and perhaps the faint ringing of a church bell in the wind. People hurry past it without listening. But the air, like memory, keeps its own rhythm. And sometimes, when the light slants just right, it seems to pause, like breath held between worlds, before continuing on. When Ellen Sadler died, the world barely blinked. The century had already learned to shout over its dead. The newspapers printed her name one last time, not because she was mourned, but because she made good copy, an oddity neatly packaged, a curiosity shelved beside tales of phantom airships and fortune-tellers. Her obituary was brief, a single column on the second page of the Portsmouth Gazette. It said, "Mrs. Ellen Bull, once known as the sleeping girl of Turville, has passed away peacefully at her home. Her extraordinary case of prolonged slumber in childhood brought her brief fame many years ago." And that was it. No mention of the bells. No mention of the notebooks or the frozen watch or the decades of quiet patience. Just a case. A medical curiosity. Something the world had already dissected and filed away. But stories have a peculiar resistance to endings. They grow again from the soil of curiosity, finding new listeners who think they're hearing it for the first time. Within months, Ellen's name began to appear in pamphlets about miracles and wonders. A penny press in London printed a lurid retelling under the headline, "The Sleeping Beauty of Buckinghamshire." It added details that never happened. Doctors fainting at her bedside, her mother struck blind by grief, even a royal visit that existed only in imagination. Ellen, in death, became a story the living could decorate. Spiritualists claimed her as proof that the soul could wander while the body rested. Doctors used her name in lectures about hysteria, female frailty, and the mysterious influence of the mind. Each profession found what it wanted in her. She was evidence, metaphor, fable, anything but a person. Odd, isn't it? How a woman can spend her life trying to be ordinary and fail simply because the world prefers her asleep. By 1915, her story had crossed oceans. American magazines ran articles titled, "The Girl Who Slept Through Time." A vaudeville show in New York even staged a dramatized version of her life, complete with painted clouds, a glowing bed, and an actress who pretended to wake to applause. The audience gasped and clapped and went home satisfied, never knowing the real woman had died 4 years earlier in a small house by the sea. Her grandchildren, grown now, tried to ignore it. But sometimes one of them would come across her name in a book or a newspaper and feel a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. They'd say, "She was family, you know," and then quickly change the subject. The church kept a record, too. A single page in the parish register. Ellen Bull, née Sadler, died aged 62, noted for long illness in youth. That was the official memory. Brief, factual, tidy. The villagers, meanwhile, passed down a more romantic version. They said she had been in love with someone who died during her sleep, that her body refused to wake until his spirit returned. Others claimed she had spoken to angels, or that her heart had stopped and started again 9 years later. The truth, already fragile, dissolved entirely in retelling. But sometimes history forgets beautifully. A schoolteacher in the 1920s made her students write essays on the sleeping girl. Some of those papers survive, handwritten, uneven, full of wonder. One child wrote, "I think she went to a place where time was still being made, and when she came back it was already finished." Another said simply, "Maybe she just needed the rest." Maybe she did. Decades passed. The world that had once surrounded Ellen vanished piece by piece. The lanes were paved, the mill closed, the fields turned to suburbs. The sound of bells faded beneath the hum of engines. And yet, every few years, her name resurfaced, on the anniversary of her awakening, in a column about medical mysteries, in a magazine's strangest true stories. Each time, the facts shifted a little more. Some said she slept for 10 years, others for 12. Some said she woke as a girl, others as a woman who had forgotten language. One account even claimed she had died in her sleep, never waking at all. She had become folklore, which is another word for memory with better posture. By the 1950s, her story appeared in books about unexplained phenomena, wedged between tales of spontaneous combustion and showers of frogs. Scientists tried to claim her as a case of pathological lethargy. Psychologists blamed trauma. Novelists borrowed her name for their heroines, changing the setting, the cause, the ending. In each version, she became a mirror for the age telling her story. In the Victorian years, she was a holy wonder. In the Edwardian era, a medical enigma. By the modern age, she was a symptom. No one asked what she had wanted to be. If you visit Turville now, you can still find the faint trace of her name carved into an old headstone behind the church. The letters are shallow, half swallowed by moss. Tourists sometimes walk past without seeing it. But occasionally someone stops, tilts their head, and runs their fingers over the stone. There's no date of the sleep, no mention of miracles, just Ellen Bull. Sometimes the air there is unnaturally still, the kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing. And if the wind shifts just right, you can hear the church bell from across the field. A soft, uncertain tolling, like a heartbeat too tired to count. It's tempting to think she'd approve of the forgetting. She'd never enjoyed being a spectacle. But there's something quietly tragic about it too, that after so many years spent between dreaming and waking, the world chose to remember her as neither. Perhaps that's the fate of anyone who slips between the lines of reason and myth, to exist in the pauses of history, in the hush between one century's curiosity and the next's indifference. And perhaps that's fair, because Ellen's story was never really about sleep. It was about waiting, about a kind of patience the world no longer understands, the patience to do nothing, to be still, to trust that life will return when it's ready. If you stand by her grave long enough, you might notice the way the air seems to hum faintly, the way sound carries differently there. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's memory. Maybe it's the echo of a girl who once learned that the deepest kind of sleep is not a surrender, but a rehearsal for waking. That's the problem with legends. They always end, but they never really stop. Ellen Sadler's story drifted quietly into the bloodstream of culture the way old myths do. Absorbed, rewritten, and misremembered until no one could tell where the truth had ended. She had stopped being a person and become a shape, a mood, a metaphor that could wear any century's clothes. The Victorians had made her saintly, the Edwardians scientific, and by the early 20th century the artists arrived to make her beautiful in the uneasy way that art often is. A painter in Vienna, enamored of symbolism, produced a series of canvases he called The Dormant Soul. In the third panel, a pale woman lay half-buried in white lilies while a clock melted quietly over her shoulder. Critics called it a meditation on purity and decay. The painter himself admitted, a little drunkenly, that he had read about a girl in England who slept through an entire decade. He never got her name right, but he didn't need to. The myth was more useful than the woman. Poets picked her up next. One wrote of Ellen of the Endless Night, who slept while angels rearranged the stars. It was published in a small collection no one read until years later, when someone set it to music. For a time, the song was played in drawing rooms across Europe, a melancholy waltz in 3/4 time. No one realized that the melody echoed the one Ellen herself had once called music for people who've never been tired. Psychologists in the 1930s claimed her for science. A French theorist, fond of the sound of his own ideas, described her case as the purest expression of the feminine retreat, a phrase that managed to sound both poetic and insulting. He wrote that women had a natural inclination to withdraw into suspended states. He didn't mention the mill smoke, the hunger, or the endless pressure to be small that had shaped Ellen's real life. For him, she was a perfect vessel, a convenient proof that fragility could be misnamed serenity. The surrealists found her too. They loved sleep, dream, the slow dissolve of reason. A short film from 1936 shows a woman lying motionless in a garden while clocks bloom like flowers around her. The credits list her only as La Dormeuse. When a journalist asked the filmmaker what it meant, he shrugged and said, "She is history taking a nap. Somewhere in all that invention, the real Ellen, the woman who mended sleeves and raised children and listened to the hum of her own quiet house, vanished completely." But that's what happens when ordinary lives intersect with myth. The myth wins. By the 1950s, her story resurfaced again in the language of neurology. Doctors used it to discuss coma states, narcolepsy, and what they now called sleeping sickness. They dissected her story without ever having met her, citing reports written by men who had never believed her to begin with. One medical student wrote a paper arguing she'd been in a prolonged fugue. His professor praised the clarity of his reasoning. Neither noticed the irony of diagnosing mystery with theory. Meanwhile, novelists reimagined her for a restless century. In one book, she became a woman frozen in ice, waiting to be thawed by love. In another, she was an allegory for England itself, silent, unchanged, dreaming through history. Each version rewrote her again. Sometimes innocent, sometimes tragic, sometimes monstrous. But always asleep because that was the only way the story worked. The feminists of the 1970s tried to reclaim her. They saw in her a quiet rebellion, a refusal to perform. A few essays called her the woman who stopped. One writer suggested that her sleep was not weakness but protest, a body's way of saying no to the endless demands of a world that wanted her visible but voiceless. Another said she represented the silence imposed on women, a century's exhaustion made flesh. They weren't wrong, not entirely. But even that reading was another kind of cage, another story placed over the woman who had simply endured. By the 1990s, she'd been reduced again, now to trivia. Did you know, said 1,000 pop histories, that in 19th century England a girl slept for 9 years? The fact became a novelty, stripped of context, retold between advertisements. The world had no time for mysteries that didn't come with answers. And yet, despite every attempt to explain or own her, Ellen's story refused to settle. It haunted the edges of art and science alike, too quiet to die. Painters still found her face in dreams. Poets still borrowed her silence. Her name became shorthand for pause, for that impossible wish to step outside of noise and stay there until the air stopped trembling. Every few years, a journalist rediscovered her. They'd visit the churchyard in Turville, take photographs of the stones softened by moss, and write some version of the same article. Who was the sleeping girl? The tone varied, sometimes skeptical, sometimes sentimental, but always hungry. The world still wanted what it had always wanted from her. A secret, a moral, a neat ending. But Ellen had never offered any of those. Even in legend, she remained unreadable, as if her long sleep had taught her one last trick to outlast interpretation. Now and then, people claimed to see her, not as a ghost exactly, more as a moment. A figure glimpsed through fog on the church path. A woman pausing at the gate just as the bells begin to toll. Nothing verifiable, just the village's way of remembering someone it can't quite let go. And if you stand there yourself, on one of those gray mornings when the air feels heavy with unsaid things, you might understand why. There's a hush that lingers, a soft vibration that seems to hum beneath the sound of the world. It isn't frightening. It's familiar. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for faith, only patience. The story, by now, has become a comfort. A reminder that stillness once existed. That once, long ago, a girl fell asleep and didn't die. The academics still argue. The writers still borrow her. The village still whispers. But if you listen carefully, beneath all the noise of interpretation, you can almost hear her answer. A voice small and steady as breath. I was tired. I rested. You would have too. By the 21st century, Ellen Sadler had become one of those names that drifts across 100 screens. Familiar but ghostly. Her story flickered between television documentaries and message boards devoted to the unexplained. A photo of her headstone would surface online, followed by paragraphs of speculation typed by strangers who wanted to believe in something old-fashioned. Miracles that hadn't yet been disproved. Medical podcasts debated her case with the weary certainty of people who think knowledge is ownership. Some host would say, clearly a psychosomatic reaction to trauma, and his guest would counter, perhaps undiagnosed encephalitis. They would both nod, satisfied, and move on to the next mystery. The sound of their voices carried that modern confidence, the kind that assumes mystery is only ignorance in disguise. Writers kept finding her. A novelist in New York used her as the model for a character who slept through the apocalypse. A poet in Manila published a book called 9 Years of Breathing. An installation artist in Berlin suspended a bed in a gallery, looping the sound of a faint heartbeat beneath white sheets. When a journalist asked what it represented, the artist said, "The world waiting to wake up." Sleep had become fashionable again. Wellness culture renamed it reset. Technology promised to measure it, improve it, optimize it. The old superstition that dreams might mean something had been replaced by graphs and percentages. And still, beneath all the noise, the same hunger lingered. The longing for permission to stop. Ellen fit perfectly into that new myth. She appeared in essays about burnout, in think pieces about the tyranny of productivity. Some writer always reached for her as a symbol, the first modern sleeper, the woman who opted out before it was cool. They admired her not for mystery but for efficiency. 9 years of rest sounded almost efficient now. Meanwhile, psychologists rediscovered her as a historical footnote. They printed her name on slides in conferences. Case study 1871, extended cataleptic state. The grainy drawing of her bed flashed across a PowerPoint screen while someone explained neural pathways in clinical monotone. In those rooms, she was data, a glitch in the machine of consciousness. But in quieter corners, the kind the internet sometimes still allows, people talked about her differently. They posted stories late at night, written in lowercase, like prayers. Sometimes I wish I could sleep like Ellen Sadler. 9 years. Wake up when the noise stops. Replies came, same. Me too. Maybe she wasn't cursed. Maybe she was lucky. Somewhere, in the constant hum of Wi-Fi and insomnia, She became the patron saint of exhaustion. Documentary crews visited Turville again. They filmed the church, the field, the headstone. The villagers, politely puzzled, offered the same lines their grandparents had given. Yes, there was a girl who slept. Yes, people came from all over. No, I don't know what happened to her. The cameras moved on, disappointed that mystery had learned to whisper. One young historian tried to track down her notebooks. They were still with a distant relative who kept them in a drawer lined with tissue paper. The pages had yellowed, the ink thinned to brown, but the handwriting remained steady. When the historian opened one at random, she found a single sentence that hadn't faded. Dreamed of waking, but everyone else was asleep. She closed the book and didn't tell the camera crew about it. Some discoveries deserve to stay private. In museums, Ellen's image appeared occasionally among exhibits about Victorian medicine. A photograph of her cottage, a reproduction of the newspaper sketch, a paragraph about the sleeping girl of Turville. Visitors passed by quickly, on their way to brighter displays. Yet every so often someone lingered, perhaps because the drawing looked too peaceful, or because the name on the caption seemed oddly familiar, like a tune remembered from childhood. Modern writers often tried to imagine what she would think of their age. An era that never stops moving, that treats rest as weakness and stillness as failure. They pictured her walking through neon streets, bemused by the glow of screens, baffled by the noise that passes for conversation. Would she laugh? Would she pity? Would she, exhausted by the electric urgency of it all, simply close her eyes again? Her story found new forms. Podcasts retold it with moody music and echoing narration. Animated shorts turned her into a spectral figure floating through time. A playwright staged Ellen Sadler, a dream in 9 acts, where each act was a year of her sleep. The audience sat in near darkness, lulled by a voice that repeated the same line at the end of every scene. The world kept breathing while she didn't. And through it all, the core remained unchanged. A girl closed her eyes. The world waited. She opened them again. Maybe that's why her story endures. It offers the one thing most stories can't: permission to stop without being condemned for it. To pause long enough for the noise to fade, for the body to remember itself. In a culture addicted to motion, her stillness feels almost radical. When the latest wave of fascination dies down, as it always does, her name will recede again into the quiet. But somewhere, some tired reader or sleepless listener will stumble across it late at night, when the city has finally gone still, and feel a small, unreasonable comfort. Because the truth is, everyone wants to believe that if they truly stopped, the world might forgive them for it. There's a certain irony in how the story of Ellen Sadler, a girl who once terrified the world by sleeping too long, has become strangely comforting in the century that followed. Her silence, her stillness, the audacity of her long pause, all of it feels less like a mystery now and more like a prophecy. She lived in an age that worshipped motion just as ours does now. The Victorians moved their machines faster and faster, built cities that never slept, and filled every quiet space with noise. The creak of factories, the ticking of clocks, the unending sermon of progress. And when Ellen fell asleep, she became their nightmare. She represented everything they feared: stillness, slowness, surrender. They called her strange. They called her sick. But beneath their fascination was something else: envy. Because while the rest of the world labored under the tyranny of time, Ellen escaped it. While men crushed coal into profit and women sewed themselves into exhaustion, a single girl in a darkened room did the one thing no one else could. She stopped. And the earth kept turning without her. Her story has always been misinterpreted as something extraordinary. A miracle, a tragedy, a scandal. But what if it wasn't any of those? What if it was just the body doing what the world would not allow, refusing to keep up? There's something quietly rebellious about that idea, especially now, when sleep itself has become a form of resistance. Today, people count their hours of rest the way their ancestors counted coins. They measure dreams with glowing wristbands. They take pills to sleep, pills to wake, and coffee to erase the difference. The modern world has become one long experiment in exhaustion, where stillness is mistaken for laziness and silence for failure. Ellen's story slips into this age like a ghost wearing the wrong century's clothes. She reminds us that once, not so long ago, someone chose not to perform for the world. She didn't collapse publicly, didn't announce her retreat. She just sank inward, deeper and deeper, until time itself gave up waiting for her. Doctors in her century called her delicate, nervous, afflicted by feminine frailty. It was their way of saying she was too soft for the world they'd built. But maybe softness wasn't her flaw, it was her rebellion. Maybe her body understood what her mind couldn't say aloud. That to survive, she had to disappear for a while. The Victorians wrote about her as though she had been claimed by something divine or terrible. But it wasn't divinity that kept her alive for 9 years. It was patience. And patience, in its purest form, is a kind of courage. It's what you hold onto when the noise of the world becomes unbearable. It's what keeps a pulse steady when time forgets your name. Think of that small room where she slept. A window cracked open, a candle burning low, the steady hum of her breath while the outside world clawed at progress. That was her rebellion. Not loud, not proud, just stubbornly alive in her own tempo. The doctors wanted to wake her because they couldn't stand her silence. They poked, pricked, whispered, shouted. Anything to prove that life needed their supervision. But she didn't stir. It must have frightened them, that stillness. To them, she wasn't merely asleep. She was proof that life could happen without permission. In their fear, they invented theories. Catalepsy, hysteria, suspended animation. None of them ever wrote the simplest one. That she was tired. The irony, of course, is that now everyone is tired. The world has replaced sleep with simulation, quiet with background noise, patience with productivity. People spend their lives convincing themselves they're awake when, in truth, they're half dreaming through the blur of screens and schedules. Ellen's story lingers because it speaks to that quiet, unspoken exhaustion, the one no doctor can diagnose. It offers the one thing we can't buy, the one thing we're too frightened to claim: permission to stop, to be still, to let the world exist without our constant supervision. She wasn't a saint or a fraud or a medical marvel. She was simply a human being who had reached the edge of her endurance. Her body did what bodies do when the soul can't bear another day of pretending. It shut the door. When she finally woke, she didn't preach about what she'd seen. She didn't declare visions of heaven or promise hidden truths. She drank tea. She asked about her mother. She went on living quietly. That's the part people forget. The real miracle wasn't that she slept. It was that she chose to keep living afterward, in a world that would never stop asking for explanations. Her silence after the awakening is what makes her story sacred. She never tried to interpret it, never claimed to understand. She simply accepted that there were parts of herself and of life that belonged to the dark. That acceptance is what terrifies us now. We want everything explained. We demand reasons, diagnoses, closure. But Ellen's long sleep refuses to give us any. It's just there, a fact, soft and unyielding, like breath. And maybe that's why her story endures. Because even though the world has changed, our fatigue hasn't. We're still searching for the permission she took. We're still afraid of quiet. We still measure our days by motion and mistake collapse for failure. Ellen's 9 years in silence stand as a reminder that the world keeps spinning even when you don't. That life can continue beautifully without your constant management. That you are not required to earn your right to rest. If her body had a message, and maybe it did, it was this: sleep is not surrender. It's repair. Stillness is not death. It's return. The Victorians called her a mystery. The modern world calls her an anomaly. But what she really was, perhaps, is something simpler: a teacher. Not through words, but through absence. She taught that living doesn't mean racing the clock. It means learning when to stop. Maybe that's why, even now, her story feels like a lullaby more than a legend. It doesn't demand belief. It just asks for breath. It reminds us that silence has its own language, and that sometimes, to hear it, you have to step outside the rush of time. If you listen long enough, you can almost hear her breathing still. Not in fear, not in struggle, just in rhythm. As if reminding us that all of this, the cities, the chaos, the noise, can wait a moment longer. And that, perhaps, is the only lesson the world ever truly needed from Ellen Sadler. That everything wakes eventually, but not before it rests. By the time the 21st century learned to fear silence, Ellen Sadler's story had turned into something almost subversive. Her 9-year sleep no longer belonged to medicine or miracle. It belonged to philosophy. She was the girl who had done what no modern person dared. She had vanished from the noise and come back sane. People think rebellion means fire and slogans, but sometimes it's just the refusal to move. Ellen's stillness was the sort that makes the world uncomfortable, the kind that reminds it how fragile its motion really is. The doctors in her day tried to shock her awake. The modern world would have handed her a phone. Both, in their own ways, were terrified of what she represented. Control surrendered, time ignored. Imagine her dropped into the present, surrounded by screens glowing with restless light. She'd walk among the sleepless, the workers and watchers, the people who scroll because the dark feels too big. She'd see us chasing wakefulness the way her century chased salvation, everyone afraid to blink. And she would understand us instantly because she had lived at the edge of that same hunger, the need to matter, the fear of stopping. Her story lingers because it promises something forbidden, that it's possible to step outside of history and survive. Not to die, not to transcend, simply to rest. The Victorians couldn't name it, we still can't. We call it burnout, depression, collapse, anything but the truth that sometimes the soul simply insists on silence. Ellen's rebellion wasn't dramatic. It didn't change governments or topple kings. It only proved that a single body could deny the world its schedule, that a pulse could continue without ambition. In that refusal there is a strange grace, the kind that modern revolutions overlook. She showed that the opposite of progress isn't failure. It's peace. If she were alive now, she'd probably be diagnosed, medicated, monitored. Her sleep would be charted, graphed, optimized. Every breath she took would be counted as data. And still, somewhere between those graphs, the mystery would persist. The quiet truth that life doesn't need measurement to be real. Ellen never preached, never explained herself. Her entire life after the awakening was a soft sermon on endurance. She lived gently, the way a candle burns when the room has already learned the value of dark. The doctors forgot her name, the villagers turned her into rumor, but the air around her story still holds a kind of reverence. Says, there is strength in being still. The lesson she left isn't comfortable. To follow it means giving up the illusion that noise equals meaning. It means learning to trust the moments when nothing happens, to believe that you are still whole when you stop producing, improving, performing. The last rebellion is rest itself. Every time someone turns off the light, sets the phone down, breathes once before answering, they are, in a small way, doing what Ellen did. Her 9-year silence was a single long heartbeat stretched across time, an act of defiance so gentle it still unsettles those who hear it. Maybe that's why her story refuses to fade. Because deep down, everyone suspects that the world could forgive them if they stopped running for just a moment. And that, like Ellen, they might wake to find that time has waited, patient and undemanding, for their return. The strange thing about stories that outlive their tellers is how they begin to change shape. Ellen Sadler's story, once a curiosity, then a legend, has become something quieter now, something closer to a mirror than a mystery. When people speak her name today, it isn't with awe or disbelief. It's with a kind of weary recognition, as though they understand her more deeply than her own century ever could. Because now, the world she left behind, the one that couldn't rest, couldn't stop, has finally caught up to her. The age of sleeplessness has become the age of screens. We sleep less than any generation before. We wake to alarms that sound like emergencies. We treat rest as a luxury to be purchased. We measure how deeply we dream, then share the results with strangers. And still, we wake up tired. Maybe that's why Ellen has found her way back into quiet corners of the collective imagination. She is no longer the sleeping girl of Turville, a curiosity for the medical journals. She's the ghost of something everyone secretly wants. When people retell her story now, it's almost always at night. Podcasts play her name over slow piano music. Narrators with calm voices say words like mystery and miracle, but what they really mean is envy. They envy a girl who stopped running. They envy the idea that a body could say no and be heard. They envy the silence that didn't need permission to exist. Ellen's sleep wasn't pretty. It wasn't poetic. It was the human body, exhausted, collapsing into its own kind of logic. She wasn't drifting through golden dreams. She was surviving in the only way she could. And yet, that survival has become a strange form of beauty, the beauty of endurance, of quiet defiance. When you think about it, there's nothing more radical than doing nothing in a world that demands constant motion. The Victorians couldn't imagine that kind of rebellion. Their idea of virtue was industriousness. Men hammering progress into iron, women sewing virtue into lace. They feared idleness as a moral disease. To sleep without working for it, to rest without earning it, that was close to sin. So when Ellen fell asleep and refused to wake, they treated her like a crisis. They called her frail, bewitched, unnatural. But beneath their disapproval was discomfort. She had taken the one freedom they didn't know how to grant themselves, the freedom to stop. That same discomfort still lingers. People now fill their silence with noise. Podcasts for washing dishes, videos for brushing teeth, music for walking, talking, driving, waiting. We are terrified of hearing nothing because silence makes the mind speak. We call it anxiety now, but the feeling is ancient. Ellen lived at the center of that silence for 9 years. Maybe that's what makes her story so haunting. She went to the place we all try to avoid, and she came back whole. It's tempting to romanticize her, to imagine her floating in a peaceful dream, untouched by pain. But the truth was far less forgiving. Her mother's exhaustion, the poverty of that little house, the cold creeping under the door. It was all still there, waiting when she woke. She didn't escape hardship. She only pressed pause on it. And yet, when she opened her eyes, she didn't seem angry or broken. She simply began again. That, in its way, is the quiet miracle at the heart of her story. The ability to start over without bitterness. Her long sleep, seen from one angle, looks like surrender. Seen from another, it looks like wisdom. Every age decides for itself which version it prefers. In ours, where exhaustion is the new normal, her story feels less like tragedy and more like truth. We understand what she couldn't say out loud. That sometimes the bravest act isn't fighting the world but withdrawing from it until it stops shouting. Ellen didn't write philosophy, but she lived one. Her life after waking was not grand or dramatic. It was modest, ordinary, deliberately uneventful. She mended sleeves, raised children, kept her garden neat. And in that simplicity lies the real echo of her defiance. After 9 years of being a spectacle, She built a life that was deliberately quiet. She refused to turn herself back into a story. She refused to perform her own myth. That choice, small, invisible, steady, was her final rebellion. Because the world will always try to turn mystery into commodity, and she wouldn't let it. She let them talk, let them write, and she lived anyway. There's a certain grace in that kind of patience. It's not the patience of saints or martyrs. It's the patience of someone who's already seen how small the world looks when viewed through the haze of half-sleep. Maybe that's why her story keeps finding its way back. Because we need reminders that quiet is still allowed. That silence, despite everything, is not empty but full of memory, of meaning, of rest. We talk about mindfulness now as though we invented it, but Ellen knew it long before the word existed. She embodied it, the art of being still without demanding reward. There's something almost monastic about her kind of stillness. Not religious, but sacred in its humility. The ability to let the noise pass through you without responding. The courage to be forgotten and not mind. The modern world is allergic to that kind of peace. Prefers spectacle, confession, visibility. We broadcast our sleeplessness the way earlier generations broadcast faith. We confess to fatigue as if it were a virtue. And all the while, the idea of true rest feels like a fairy tale. Too good, too slow, too impossible. But Ellen's life, stripped of its myth, says otherwise. It says that silence is not the absence of living. It's the space where living gathers strength. It says that time continues whether you race it or not. It says that sleep, in all its mystery, might be the body's oldest form of wisdom. When she died, the world barely noticed. The papers gave her 2 paragraphs. The doctors had moved on. But perhaps that was the ending she deserved. Not fireworks, not sainthood. Just a soft return to the quiet she'd always understood best. Her story didn't need closure. It needed peace. If she could speak to us now, maybe she would tell us to rest. Not for 9 years, not out of despair, but out of mercy. For ourselves, for each other, for the world that's forgotten how. Maybe she would say that the real rebellion isn't in sleeping forever, but in remembering how to wake gently. Because waking, like living, doesn't have to be violent. It can be as slow as breath, as patient as morning light on a window. Ellen's life has become a legend about a girl who escaped time. But perhaps the truer story is this. She didn't escape it. She forgave it. She forgave time for rushing, for taking, for demanding. And in that forgiveness, she found a stillness the rest of us are still chasing. The world will continue to tell her story, reshaping it to fit its own needs. Science will keep diagnosing. Artists will keep dreaming. The tired will keep listening for her name when they can't sleep. But somewhere, beyond the noise of retelling, there's a woman who once lay perfectly still, neither saint nor symbol, just human. And through that quiet, she taught us the most difficult thing, that to rest is to live without fear. It's remarkable how certain stories refuse to fade, even when time politely asks them to. Ellen Sadler's story is one of them. It has drifted through generations like dust that refuses to settle, reappearing whenever the world begins to feel too fast, too loud, too tired. She is the ghost that modernity keeps summoning without meaning to. The girl who stopped moving. The girl who wouldn't leave. Every century has tried to claim her for itself. The Victorians called her a miracle. The Edwardians called her an anomaly. The modern age calls her a metaphor. She has been a saint, a fraud, a patient, a poem, and a warning, all without lifting a finger. And maybe that's her quiet revenge on history. She outlasted the people who tried to explain her. When you look at the earliest sketches of her, the woodcut drawings printed in thin black ink, you see a pale figure framed by lace curtains. She's asleep, of course, but the artist always gave her an expression that doesn't belong to sleep at all. Her eyes are closed, but the corners of her mouth carry the faintest trace of knowing, as if she's aware of being watched, as if she's still slightly awake, in some other way. That's how legends work. They live in that sliver between truth and imagination. Ellen's story slipped into folklore almost without effort. Old women told it to children when they couldn't sleep. Priests mentioned it in sermons about patience. Teachers used it as a warning against idleness. Every retelling changed something, but the heart stayed the same. A girl who fell asleep and let the world hurry past her. In some versions, she was punished by God for laziness. In others, she was chosen by heaven to bear witness to eternity. A few even said she had seen angels, though none could agree on what they looked like. Each retelling reflected the storyteller more than it did her. That's the nature of myth. We use other people's silence to hear ourselves. Folklorists who visited Turville in the 1920s wrote that locals still spoke of her as if she had only recently lived. One farmer told them that on certain foggy mornings, you could hear the girls breathing in the wind. Another said the grass never grew evenly on the patch of earth where her cottage once stood. It's like the ground remembers her stillness, he said. They wrote it down, smiling at the superstition, but even then, some part of them wanted to believe it. As decades passed, her name traveled further. A playwright turned her into a ghostly figure who wandered through dreams, guiding the restless to peace. A filmmaker turned her story into a silent film. Appropriate, really. In that version, she never wakes at all. The reel ends with her still asleep, her face luminous in candlelight. The final title card reads, "Some dreams are kinder than mornings." Audiences wept. By the late 20th century, she had become an academic curiosity again. Her name appeared in footnotes about early neurology, in case studies on psychosomatic illness. Researchers described her in the cold language of observation. Patient remained in prolonged cataleptic state for approximately 9 years. Nothing more. No mention of the cottage, or the mother's endless watch, or the candle that burned beside the bed. Facts are tidy, but they are never alive. And yet, the story kept breathing. Every few years, a journalist rediscovered her, the sleeping girl of Turville, England's forgotten mystery. Always the same headline, always the same photo, always the same fascination with her stillness. What they never realized was that their obsession was the proof of her endurance. She had become the symbol of everything the modern world can't bear. The idea that life can go on without our interference. Her story appears now in unexpected places, on social media, in late-night posts by people who can't rest, who scroll through their insomnia looking for quiet. They share her name like a spell. The girl who slept for 9 years. Imagine waking to find the world older and gentler. Maybe she knew something we don't. For a moment, the comment sections go still. It's not faith. It's recognition. People see in her what they wish for themselves. Permission. Permission to vanish, to rest, to refuse. Permission to not perform survival so loudly. The internet has made her myth strange and new. Artists illustrate her surrounded by stars, her hair tangled with clocks. Poets write her as the mother of sleep, the patron of dreamers, the goddess of pause. She has become timeless precisely because she ignored time. But what would Ellen think of all this? She was never trying to make a statement. She was never a prophet or a philosopher. She was a girl who got tired. A girl who didn't wake up when people wanted her to. A girl whose silence frightened others into talking. Her rebellion was accidental. Her peace was mistaken for mystery. That's the cruelty of legends. They turn people into lessons. Ellen was never meant to be a metaphor, but we've made her one because she fits so easily into our longing. She's what we wish we could be. Untouched by hurry, unashamed of rest, unconcerned with the world's demands. She is proof that stillness, once chosen, can outlast every form of motion. If you visit her grave now, the stone is nearly smooth. Moss has filled the letters. The wind has softened the edges. Tourists rarely find it without help. Those who do often leave flowers, not for superstition but gratitude. Maybe they've read about her. Maybe they just like the idea of her. Either way, they stand in the quiet and feel something ancient move in them. A slow recognition that all things eventually return to rest. Sometimes the church bell rings while they're there. Just once, just enough to make the air vibrate. And in that small moment, you can almost believe that time itself pauses out of respect for her. Not for the legend, but for the act. The act of stopping. Ellen's story has lasted not because it explains anything, but because it refuses to. She remains uncooperative, unclassified, unhurried. That is her gift to the centuries that followed. We can study her, romanticize her, misunderstand her, but we can never fix her into meaning. And maybe that's why she's still here, quietly haunting us. Because in a world desperate to label and know, she reminds us that some lives are meant to be mysteries. That some questions deserve no answer. That sometimes the only wisdom worth keeping is the kind that lets the world go quiet long enough for breath to return. She's gone, of course. But every time a sleepless soul closes their eyes and whispers, just for a moment, she stirs in history's bed again. The bells ring somewhere far away, and the air seems to hold its breath. Not out of fear, out of memory, out of love. The world that remembers Ellen Sadler no longer resembles the one she left behind. And yet, in some strange way, it behaves exactly as she would have expected. The machines are faster, the lights brighter, the voices louder, but the restlessness is the same. Every age convinces itself that it has mastered time, and every age forgets that time is not the enemy. It is the witness. Ellen never tried to conquer it. That was her secret. The Victorians fought time with invention. We fight it with information. She simply stepped aside and let it pass. That single act has made her immortal in a way no machine or book could. When her story surfaces now, it doesn't feel like history. It feels like prophecy. People read about her and sense a faint, disorienting recognition. It's as if her 9 years of stillness weren't in the past at all, but waiting somewhere ahead of us, an inheritance we haven't yet learned to claim. Maybe the future belongs not to those who run, but to those who finally stop. In every version of her story, whether printed on yellowed paper or whispered through earbuds, there's always a moment of quiet. The narrator lowers their voice. The audience holds its breath. That's where she lives now, in that pause between sentences. The space where nothing happens. The place where everything begins again. Ellen's stillness has become a kind of theology. Not a religious one, but a spiritual geometry. A way of understanding the world by subtraction. She showed that absence can be full, that silence can contain meaning, that doing nothing can sometimes be the most complete act of being. It's a paradox that modern minds still struggle to accept. We measure success by motion, productivity by exhaustion. She measured life by breath. There is something deeply human in that simplicity. When you imagine her in that small cottage, thin blankets, candle flicker, her mother's patient hand resting near, what you're seeing isn't miracle or madness. It's trust. Trust that life continues even when consciousness doesn't. Trust that waking will come when it must. People often ask what she dreamed during those 9 years. The newspapers speculated endlessly. Doctors took notes. Clergymen prayed. But she never gave them the story they wanted. She said only, "I dreamed of bells." That's all. Bells. Human invention meeting the wind. Noise with purpose. A sound meant to remind the living that they are still alive. That answer, so plain and so strange, has haunted thinkers for generations. The bells in her dreams have come to symbolize everything. the passage of time, the call to awakening, the heartbeat of the world. But maybe they meant nothing. Maybe they were exactly what she said they were. Sound, rhythm, something to hold on to in the dark. Still, the idea lingers that the bells were her guide back, the thread between sleep and waking. When she opened her eyes after 9 years, the first thing she asked was whether they had rung. They had. Her story begins and ends with that sound. Now, more than a century later, we live surrounded by different kinds of bells. Notifications, alarms, alerts are mechanical reminders that the world demands our attention. We've replaced the church tower with the screen. And in doing so, we've forgotten that the purpose of a bell is not to keep us awake, but to call us home. That's what Ellen's story has become. A call home, not to a place but to a pace, a rhythm, a heartbeat slower than the one we've learned to live by. She reminds us that stopping isn't the same as quitting, that rest is a form of participation, that silence is not absence but preparation. Every era that rediscovers her changes her slightly, but the core remains. She is the girl who slept, yes, but she is also the woman who woke. And that second act, the quiet one, is the part that truly matters. Anyone can fall into stillness. Few can carry it back into motion. When Ellen awoke, she didn't become a prophet or a spectacle. She became a person again. She cooked, she laughed, she loved. She carried the memory of the dark gently, like a folded letter she never opened. That's the grace of survival. Not in forgetting the silence, but in learning to live beside it. There's something profoundly modern about that. We all live beside our silences now. They hum behind us in the spaces between emails, in the pauses before sleep, in the moments when the noise finally falters and we're forced to hear ourselves think. That's when Ellen returns, not as a ghost, but as a reminder. A breath saying, see, the world is still here, even when you aren't watching. Philosophers have written entire treatises trying to define consciousness, to explain why we dream. None of them have managed what she did, to embody the question itself. Her 9 years are the riddle, and her life after is the answer. You wake. You continue. You carry the stillness with you so the noise doesn't win. If you stand now in Turville churchyard and close your eyes, you might hear more than wind. You might hear the faint toll of a bell, or your own heartbeat echoing back from the past. It doesn't matter which. Both mean the same thing. Time is passing and so are you. And that's all it ever needed to mean. Ellen Sadler's silence hasn't vanished. It has only changed form. It lives in every deep breath taken before an apology. In every pause between words that might hurt. In every morning someone chooses not to rush. It lingers wherever patience still survives. The Victorians built monuments to their noise. Ellen built nothing, and yet her stillness endures. Because all monuments crumble, but the quiet remains. And maybe that's the real secret behind her story, the one no one ever wrote down. That the world doesn't remember what you shouted. It remembers what you listened to. If you go to Turville now, there's not much left that remembers her. The cottage is gone. The field has been cut into neat parcels. The air hums with the slow ache of distant traffic instead of church bells. But if you linger, if you wait until twilight when the sky forgets its colors, you can almost sense it, the stillness that once surrounded her. It's not haunted, not cold, just full. Full in the way an empty room is full of breath. Ellen Sadler has become one of those rare figures who seems to live in the pause between centuries. Every generation finds her, rewrites her, loses her, then finds her again. It's as if history itself keeps waking and asking the same question. What did she know that we don't? The truth might be painfully simple. She knew how to stop. To stop not as an act of failure, not as a confession of defeat, but as a quiet alignment with something older than reason. When Ellen lay still for those 9 years, The world called her ill, idle, bewitched. But perhaps she had simply stepped into the natural rhythm that everything else in nature already obeys, the rhythm of retreat and return, of hibernation and renewal. Every living thing does it, except us. We are the species that forgot how to rest. We build our days out of alarms and appointments, our nights out of distractions. We have lights that defy darkness, music that fills silence, and screens that chase away sleep. Yet somehow, beneath all of that noise, there remains a small, quiet envy of people like Ellen. Not because she slept, but because she didn't need to justify it. She lived in a time before self-help books and wellness slogans. No one told her to optimize her rest or improve her dream quality. Her sleep wasn't curated, it simply happened. A body collapsing into silence because the world had asked too much of it. The kind of surrender that modern life has turned into luxury. And when she woke, she didn't try to explain it. She didn't write memoirs or give interviews. She didn't call it enlightenment. She just carried on. Her only public act was survival. That, more than the sleep itself, is what makes her story miraculous. She woke and lived quietly. No bitterness, no grand revelation. No need to turn her pain into a lesson for others. She didn't owe the world an explanation. In that refusal lies the most radical form of peace. If you strip her story down to its bones, no headlines, no diagnoses, no superstition, what remains is a lesson the world keeps forgetting. You don't have to move to matter. You don't have to speak to exist. You don't have to prove your presence by filling the air. Ellen's 9 years of sleep were not a void. They were a season. Every life has them, though few last so long. Periods when motion ceases, when the world feels distant, when everything that once seemed urgent fades into irrelevance. We call those times depression, burnout, despair. Perhaps they're not always illness. Perhaps they're the body's way of remembering how to pause. When Ellen opened her eyes in 1880 and asked for tea, she wasn't performing a miracle. She was returning to the world after the kind of rest it never forgives. The first breath after deep silence is always awkward. It catches, it trembles, but it's the only way to begin again. That's the part her story offers to anyone listening now. The knowledge that beginnings don't need fanfare. They just need breath. Sometimes, when people write about her, they call her the girl who slept through time. It's a romantic phrase, but it misses the truth. She didn't sleep through time. She joined it. She moved at its pace, the slow, invisible pace that everything else in nature understands but humans have forgotten. The trees know it. The tide knows it. The heart, if you listen carefully, beats in that same slow language. Ellen was fluent in it long before the rest of us remembered how to listen. And maybe that's why her name still moves quietly through the world. She doesn't demand to be remembered, but the world keeps doing it anyway. Because every time we fall silent, when we hold our breath in wonder, or grief, or awe, something in that silence hums with her rhythm. You can find it anywhere if you know how to look. In the moment before a symphony begins, when all the instruments are poised and waiting. In the hush before a storm, when the air thickens with its own anticipation. In the way a sleeping child's chest rises and falls, slow and steady, as though the world has temporarily forgiven itself. That's her gift to time. A reminder that quiet doesn't erase meaning. It deepens it. That the moments when nothing seems to happen are the ones that hold everything together. If Ellen had written, she might have said it better. But she didn't need words. Her life said it for her. She became the shape of stillness itself, carved into memory not by action, but by absence. And now, more than a century later, when the world scrolls and shouts and burns through its own attention span, her story still waits, patient and unhurried. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't need proof. It simply says, stop, just for a moment. Listen, because somewhere, under all the noise, there's a heartbeat. It's yours. It's hers. It's the same. The bells are still ringing, faintly, through the centuries. The same sound that once called Ellen back to the waking world now echoes in ours. An invitation to rest, to breathe, to remember what it means to be alive. And maybe that's all she ever wanted to teach us. That there's no shame in stillness, no failure in stopping. That sometimes, to wake fully, you first have to fall completely silent. By the time the 20th century dimmed into the 21st, Ellen Sadler had become more myth than memory. Yet the myth continued to breathe with its own slow, steady pulse. She was no longer a figure confined to her century, nor even to England. She had slipped into something broader, something almost elemental. Wherever the world grew restless, her story drifted in, an old whisper reminding people that silence still existed somewhere, waiting to be found. The idea of her became softer with time, less about the spectacle of her sleep and more about what it meant. The girl who had once been prodded by doctors and sketched by reporters now existed as an idea, a metaphor for the gentlest kind of rebellion, the refusal to keep pace with a world that doesn't know how to stop. In a strange way, Ellen had done what philosophers and prophets never could. She had proven that life continues without our constant participation. She had made herself irrelevant and, in doing so, unforgettable. The Victorians tried to make sense of her through science. We, in our time, do the same through metaphor. We say she slept through the world, but really, the world slept through her. While everyone else worried about progress and perfection, she dissolved into the deepest rhythm life could offer. She surrendered not as defeat but as faith, the quiet belief that waking would come when it was ready. That surrender has become her legacy. If you close your eyes and picture her now, not the newspaper sketch, not the pale figure framed by curtains, but the woman she became, you can see it clearly. Ellen Sadler, older, hair streaked with silver, sitting in the soft light of a small window, her hands folded on her lap. She's not thinking of fame or fear or what the doctors said. She's listening. To what? No one can be sure. Maybe to her own pulse. Maybe to the quiet. Maybe to the memory of bells. That image, simple and still, is the true rebirth of her story. For centuries, people have misunderstood rest as emptiness, as the absence of doing. Ellen's life corrects that mistake. Her long silence was not a void. It was a space where life quietly rearranged itself, like winter making room for spring, like the ocean retreating before the next wave. Stillness, she reminds us, is not nothing, it's preparation. When she woke after 9 years, she didn't deliver revelations or prophecies. She didn't declare that she'd seen God or eternity. She asked for tea. She asked about her mother. She stepped back into her small, ordinary life with the ease of someone who had simply been gone longer than expected. And maybe that's what makes her story so strangely holy, her return to the mundane. Because to wake up and want something as ordinary as tea after 9 years of sleep isn't small. It's sacred. It's the act of rejoining the living world, one sip at a time. People tend to think rebirth must be grand, dramatic, full of light and trumpets. But the truth is, most of us return quietly. We wake from heartbreak, from grief, from exhaustion, not with declarations but with small gestures. We make coffee. We open a window. We go for a walk. We start again, clumsily, gently, without applause. Ellen understood that before anyone else. Her entire life after waking was a lesson in quiet continuation. She didn't need to speak about endurance. She embodied it. Every day she lived after those 9 years was a soft declaration. I'm still here. There's something profoundly comforting about that. She was not destroyed by her sleep. She was tempered by it. She became the still point the world could not quite erase. If she had a philosophy, and maybe she did, it would have been this: nothing in nature rushes, and yet everything is done. She lived in accordance with that rhythm long before it was written into quotes and posted on screens. She practiced the art of patience as instinct, not trend. And that patience has outlived her. You can feel it in her story even now. The steady breath of it. The way it moves at its own pace, refusing to hurry toward its ending. That's why it still works as a lullaby for sleepless ages. It doesn't command you to rest. It simply reminds you that rest is already waiting, quietly, just behind the noise. The idea of her, stretched across centuries, has become something like a shared dream. A story told not to solve anything, but to soften the edges of the waking world. A reminder that survival doesn't always mean movement. That sometimes it looks like lying still while the world rearranges itself around you. Perhaps that's why her story has never really ended. Because it isn't about her anymore. It's about the part of everyone that wants to stop and can't. The part that aches for permission to lay down the burden of becoming and simply be. If you visit Turville today, you might not find her grave right away. It's tucked near the back of the churchyard, beneath a low yew tree. The stone is nearly blank now. But if you stand there long enough, you can hear what she must have heard. The wind moving through the grass, the distant toll of the bell, the patient rhythm of the world continuing without hurry. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the truest kind of rebirth isn't waking with new purpose, but remembering how to move in time with the quiet again. Ellen didn't change the world. She reminded it to breathe. And if you listen closely enough, beneath the hum of traffic, beneath the pulse of your own rushing thoughts, you might still catch the faintest echo of her silence. It's not a command. It's an invitation. An invitation to stop measuring, stop striving, stop counting, and to simply trust, as she once did, that waking will always come when it's ready. There's a certain kind of immortality that doesn't need marble or memory. It's the kind that lingers not in books or monuments, but in the rhythm of the air itself, in pauses, in quiet, in the small moments that no one writes down. That's the kind of immortality Ellen Sadler earned. Not through fame, not through discovery, but through stillness. When people die, we usually measure their lives by what they did. Ellen's, instead, is measured by what she didn't do. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't perform. And somehow, in not doing, she achieved what most lives never reach: permanence. Her silence outlasted the noise of her century. Even now, when her name appears in dusty archives or late-night documentaries, there's always a tone of disbelief, as if the world can't quite accept that someone could live outside of its rhythm and remain unharmed. We ask the same questions her doctors once did. How did she survive? What caused it? But those questions miss the point. Her story has never been about explanation. It's been about endurance. What people never seem to realize is that Ellen's sleep wasn't an escape from life. It was a strange, prolonged conversation with it. She didn't flee from the world. She simply stopped answering its noise. For 9 years, she let it speak over her. And when she woke, she carried that quiet with her like a secret language. The people who knew her said she had a calmness about her that never left. It wasn't saintly, not even spiritual, just something unbreakable. She'd survived without resistance, and that left its mark. When she walked through the village after her waking, people would pause in their work and lower their voices. Not out of pity, but reverence. They saw in her something the world couldn't manufacture. A peace that wasn't bought, earned, or learned, only lived. We tend to think of peace as an emotion, but Ellen turned it into presence. It wasn't what she felt. It was what she became. Her silence was no longer absence, it was identity. That's what makes her story timeless. She embodies what every restless heart still craves: the freedom to rest without fear of being forgotten. because that's what the world really fears, isn't it? Not death, not silence, but insignificance. The idea that stopping means disappearing. Ellen disproved that. She stopped for 9 years, and more than a century later, people are still saying her name. It's hard not to see the poetry in that. Some nights, when the wind is low and the stars are quiet, you can imagine her voice, soft, unhurried, speaking to no one in particular. She'd say, perhaps, that stillness was never meant to frighten us. That silence is not the opposite of life, but its truest companion. That everything we rush toward is already waiting for us in the dark. She might say that time is not a ladder we climb, but a tide we learn to float in. That you don't lose the world when you stop moving. You find it again, closer this time, clearer, stripped of its noise. The Victorians thought she was a miracle. The doctors thought she was a mystery. Maybe she was just an early example of what the rest of us are now slowly learning. That the body has its own wisdom, and that wisdom is sometimes silence. Modern science would say her story proves nothing. There are no data, no reliable witnesses, no measurable outcomes. But perhaps that's exactly what makes it important. In a time when everything can be recorded, analyzed, and explained, Ellen remains uncooperative. She refuses to fit into theory. She reminds us that the human experience is not a puzzle to be solved. It's a breath to be taken. Her silence isn't an absence in the record. It's a defiance of it. She left no great writings, no sermons, no philosophies. She left an example, one so simple that it borders on cosmic. To live is to rest. To rest is to trust. To trust is to continue. When people visit her grave, they often say they feel something. Not ghostly, not supernatural, just a hush, as if the air itself remembers the discipline of being still. That hush is her immortality. It moves through the grass, through the wind, through the soft murmur of the world forgetting to hurry. There's a line from a poem written about her in the 1920s. She spoke not, yet her silence said the world's first prayer. The poet likely meant it figuratively, but there's something literal in it too. Ellen's sleep was prayer, the kind that doesn't use words, the kind that trusts the universe to finish the sentence. And perhaps that's what all real peace sounds like. Not music, not revelation, just breathing. If you think of her now, don't picture the girl in the bed, or the curious doctors hovering with ink-stained pens. Picture the quiet she left behind. Still here, in every patient heartbeat, in every long pause before dawn, in every moment you choose not to speak. That's where she lives. Not in the past, but in every silence that the present still dares to make. Ellen Sadler, the girl who slept for 9 years, has long since turned to dust. But her stillness endures, passed quietly from body to body, like a genetic memory of calm. A reminder that silence, once learned, never truly leaves you. And maybe that's immortality enough. In the end, all that remains of Ellen Sadler's story is a sound. Not her voice, not the scratch of her mother's pen, not even the rustle of sheets in that dim little cottage, but the faint echo of a bell that has never stopped ringing. It isn't a real bell, of course. It's the sound that lives behind her story, the soft vibration that hums through every retelling, every whisper of her name. That sound has become a kind of pulse for anyone who finds her again. You can almost hear it when the world goes still, when the traffic fades, when the city pauses between one noise and the next. It's there, low and steady, the quiet reminder that life never really stops. It just changes tempo. For 9 years, Ellen's life slowed to that frequency. While the world rushed around her, she existed in the space between seconds. And somehow, she carried that rhythm with her when she woke. Those who knew her said she never raised her voice, never hurried, never seemed surprised by anything. She moved like a clock underwater. One neighbor wrote, A strange description, but fitting. She had spent nearly a decade beneath the surface of time, and when she rose again, she refused to drown in its noise. The world has always been afraid of that kind of calm. Even now, in an age that pretends to worship peace, we still fear it. We meditate for 10 minutes, then check the clock. We call it mindfulness, but we treat it like exercise, a thing to finish. Ellen didn't finish her stillness. She lived inside it. That's why her story endures. Not because of its strangeness, but because it offers a version of peace that doesn't expire. A kind of silence that doesn't demand attention, doesn't ask to be earned. Just a quiet that exists for its own sake, like breath. If you listen closely to her legend, you start to realize it was never about sleep. It was about faith. Not religious faith, but the faith that life continues even when we're not looking. The faith that the sun rises, that the body heals, that the world keeps spinning without our supervision. The Victorians, with their brass watches and rigid schedules, could never understand that. They saw rest as surrender. The modern world isn't much different. We've turned exhaustion into identity. We celebrate the tired, the overworked, the unstoppable. We've forgotten that stopping isn't failure. It's how everything alive survives. Ellen never said a word about her experience, and that silence has frustrated people for more than a century. We want explanations. We crave meaning. We demand that every story teach us something we can repeat. But maybe her silence was the lesson. Maybe the point was that not everything that matters can be translated into words. That's why her story feels so modern, even now. It lives in the spaces language can't reach. You don't listen to it for facts, you feel it somewhere behind the ribs, in that spot where your heartbeat slows when you remember to breathe. Writers still borrow her image. Filmmakers still use her name. They paint her as the saint of sleep, the ghost of peace, the dreamer who swallowed time. But none of them quite capture her, because her story doesn't belong to storytelling anymore. It belongs to the spaces between it, the quiet that begins after the final line fades. There's a church in Turville where her grave lies half hidden under ivy. Visitors rarely speak when they find it. The place has that peculiar hush that all old churchyards have, but with her it feels heavier, deeper. The air seems to hum. The leaves barely move. It's not eerie. It's gentle, the kind of stillness that feels aware of itself. One writer who visited her grave in the 1980s described the moment in his diary. I stood by the stone and realized the silence wasn't absence. It was waiting. I had the feeling that if I spoke too loudly, she might hear me and turn over in her sleep. He didn't publish that line, but it survives in his notes. Perhaps he understood that some thoughts aren't meant for print. The longer her story lingers, the less it feels like a story and the more it feels like an inheritance. The reminder that stillness, once practiced, can outlive the body. It moves through generations like breath through rooms, invisible but persistent. That's the real bell, the one that never stopped. Not metal, not church-made, but human. The heartbeat that continues whether the body is asleep or awake. Ellen spent 9 years listening to it, then a lifetime teaching the rest of us how to hear it. Because that's what she became, in the end, not a miracle, not a myth, but a frequency. A sound just below hearing. A vibration that sits in the pause before a sigh, in the stillness before dawn, in the moment after a song ends and the air forgets how to move. She's there, in all of it, reminding us gently that nothing living ever truly stops. Not hearts, not time, not stories. And maybe that's why, even now, when the world grows unbearably loud, her name feels like a spell. It slows the breath, it steadies the hands, says without saying you can rest. The world will wait, and somewhere far off, through the folds of time, the bell that once called her back from darkness keeps ringing. Soft, patient, eternal. There comes a point, toward the end of every story, when it stops belonging to words and begins belonging to silence. That's where we are now, drifting toward the edge of Ellen Sadler's life. The place where memory fades and meaning hums softly beneath it all. The place she knew best. By now, more than a century has passed since she closed her eyes for the last time. The details of her life have thinned, as all details eventually do. Her children's names, the layout of the cottage, the smell of the air that last morning, all gone. What remains isn't the data of her existence, but the rhythm of it. The pulse. The same quiet cadence that carried her through her long sleep and into the lives of those who came after. Ellen Sadler isn't really remembered as a person anymore. She's an atmosphere. You feel her, rather than know her. She exists in that hush between stories, in that pause after someone says her name and no one quite knows what to add. The silence is her legacy. If you think about it, that's how time works too. It doesn't end. It just slows, folds, softens. The hours that were once frantic lose their urgency, and what's left is space. Room for air, for thought, for memory. Ellen's 9 years were that kind of space stretched wide enough for the whole world to fit inside. She gave us an unintentional gift, a human example of eternity. Not the eternal life promised by religion, but the kind that happens when time loses its teeth. The kind that teaches you that being and doing are not the same, that existing can be enough. We rarely allow ourselves that grace. Even now, when we talk about peace, we still attach it to purpose. Meditation must make us productive. Rest must recharge us for more work. But Ellen's stillness wasn't a means to anything. It didn't prepare her for greatness or transformation. It simply was. It existed for itself, pure and without apology. And that's what unsettled people most about her story. The idea that someone could live without striving. That a human life could be complete without proving, achieving, or explaining. It was, and remains, an affront to our constant performance. When she woke, she didn't become wise or saintly. She became ordinary again. But that ordinariness was transformed. The small acts of living, a cup of tea, a walk in the garden, the folding of a blanket were enough. After 9 years of nothing, everything must have felt like a miracle. The smell of bread, the sound of rain, the flicker of candlelight on a wall. She had been reminded of what the rest of us forget every day. That the simple act of being alive is already extraordinary. Sometimes, when I think about her story, I imagine those first mornings after she woke. The world must have seemed impossibly bright, every sound too loud, every breath too sharp, and yet she endured it, slowly, quietly, until the rhythm of living felt natural again. That is another kind of strength, the courage to return from silence. She didn't write about it, of course. She never claimed revelation. She just continued, and maybe that's the real measure of enlightenment. Not grand speeches, not sudden clarity, but the quiet willingness to go on living, day after day, without needing to understand everything. It's tempting to look for meaning in her sleep, to say it was divine, or psychological, or symbolic. But maybe it wasn't any of those. Maybe it was just rest. And maybe rest, in its purest form, is what we've been mistaking for transcendence all along. That thought feels almost radical now, that the path to peace isn't through effort, but through surrender. That sometimes the most profound thing you can do is nothing at all. The world has changed around her story. Empires have risen and collapsed. Wars have come and gone. People have learned to fly, to broadcast, to speak across oceans of light. But no invention, no progress, has managed to silence that one small question her story leaves behind. What would happen if we stopped? Not forever, just long enough to hear what the world sounds like without us talking over it. Long enough to notice that it still breathes, even when we don't direct it. Ellen's 9 years remind us that we are not the clock. We are what it measures. We are what keeps time company. When you walk through her village now, the bells still ring. Not as often, not as loud, but enough. Their sound rolls through the air like a slow breath. Ancient, familiar, patient. Somewhere, maybe that's her lullaby to the living. Her reminder that no matter how far we race from silence, it is always waiting, open-armed, unoffended, unchanged. If ghosts exist, perhaps they aren't the dead at all. Perhaps they're the moments we leave unfinished, the silences we abandon too quickly. Ellen's ghost isn't haunting her village. It's haunting time itself, the quiet we no longer make room for. And so, more than 100 years later, we still find ourselves listening for her. In every pause that feels too long, in every deep breath before speaking, in every moment when the world seems to hold itself still, she is there. Not sleeping anymore, but resting still, teaching still. Because maybe the bell never really stopped. Maybe it's been ringing all this time, quietly calling us home to the same lesson she lived without words. That it's okay to stop, that it's okay to rest, that even in stillness the world continues. The story of Ellen Sadler ends the way all stories should. Not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the sound of something fading beautifully into quiet. The world has turned more than 100 times since her heart stopped beating, but the air around her name still hums with the same rhythm. The low, patient pulse of someone who knew how to wait. If you walk through Turville on a gray afternoon, when the mist hangs low over the fields, you'll notice that it's a place designed for stillness. The cottages are modest, the lanes narrow, the trees old enough to remember the century that first whispered her story. The church still stands, its bell tower crooked with age, and if you happen to arrive at the right hour, you'll hear it. The slow toll that rolls over the hills, the same kind of sound that once woke a sleeping girl from her 9-year dream. It's said that the bell's tone has changed over time, that the metal softened with weather and repetition. But that feels right. All stories, like bells, change their pitch as they pass through hands and hearts. Ellen's has become less about medicine and miracle and more about meaning. Less about how she slept and more about what her silence revealed. Her legend has survived because it speaks to something buried deep in the human body, the longing for rest that never quite disappears. You can see it in the faces of people on late trains, eyes glazed, heads nodding. You can hear it in the quiet desperation of someone saying, "I just need a break." It's in the pulse that quickens when we realize another year has slipped by and we've done nothing but rush. Ellen's sleep was extreme, yes, but the instinct behind it is ordinary. It's the same instinct that makes birds stop singing before rain, that makes forests pause before dawn. It's the body's way of saying, enough. We live in a world that has forgotten that word. We call stillness laziness, silence awkwardness, and rest a privilege. We build our days like battlegrounds, measuring worth by what survives the night. But Ellen's story, small, soft, enduring, asks us to remember that life doesn't need to be earned. It only needs to be lived. When she awoke, she didn't write about it. She didn't turn her experience into prophecy or poetry. She didn't travel, or teach, or explain. She simply stepped back into her life. That quiet decision, so unremarkable to others, was a kind of miracle in itself. The ability to return without drama, to live without spectacle, to continue without applause. It's hard to imagine that kind of peace now. The world rewards confession and spectacle. We share our every breath, every thought, every sleepless night. Silence feels like disappearance, and disappearance feels like death. But Ellen didn't disappear when she slept. She existed in another rhythm, one slower and older than history. And when she woke, she carried that rhythm with her. Maybe that's what holiness really looks like. Not miracles, but balance. the ability to move with the world instead of against it, the grace to know when to stop and when to start again. Her long silence, once treated as illness, now feels like wisdom. It's as if she was practicing the art of ending without fear, the art of surrendering to what is inevitable, because every life, no matter how loud, eventually meets the quiet. And maybe the real purpose of living is to learn how to meet it gently. There's something beautiful about that thought, that all of us are slowly learning Ellen's lesson. Not by sleeping for 9 years, but by inching closer to stillness in our own small ways. The deep breath before a decision, the pause before answering, the walk taken without destination, the moments when we stop trying to be immortal and remember that being temporary is the point. The newspapers that once shouted about her called her a wonder, a marvel, an impossibility. But the truth is simpler and more human. She was tired. She rested. She woke. She lived. And if that sounds too small to matter, perhaps that's because we've forgotten how big the ordinary really is. Imagine the morning she finally opened her eyes. The faint gray light slipping through the window. The quiet breath of her mother asleep in the chair beside her. The smell of tea cooling on the table. The world waiting just as it always had. She must have blinked and thought, so it's still here. And maybe she smiled. That smile, if it happened, is the real ending of her story. Not the doctor's reports. Not the gossip of neighbors. Not the fading ink in newspapers. Just a woman waking and realizing that life, despite everything, had been kind enough to wait. When you strip away the myth, that's all she ever was. Someone who trusted the world to hold her while she rested. And the world, surprisingly, did. It's easy to think her story belongs to another time, but it doesn't. It belongs to every person who has ever stared at the ceiling in the dark, wondering if they'll ever feel rested again. It belongs to every person who has watched the clock and wished it would slow. It belongs to anyone who has ever wanted to step out of time and be forgiven for it. Ellen's silence, stretched across centuries, has become a kind of prayer. Not one that asks for anything, just one that listens. The prayer of breath, of patience, of faith that waking will come when it's ready. And so her bell keeps ringing, even now. Not in the church tower, but in the small spaces of the world. In the soft hum of a refrigerator at midnight. In the whisper of leaves outside a window. In the steady rhythm of your own heartbeat when you finally stop rushing. It rings for everyone still searching for permission to rest. Because that's the secret her story has guarded all this time, that you are allowed to stop. You are allowed to step out of the current, to close your eyes, to let the world take care of itself for a while. You are allowed to sleep. The world won't end. The bells will keep ringing. And when you wake, whether in 9 hours or 9 years, the light will still be there, waiting for you, patient as always. That is Ellen's gift to us, her last quiet miracle. Proof that the world continues without our constant management. That peace does not need explanation, and that silence, once embraced, can become its own form of forever. So if you find yourself awake tonight, listening to the hum of the world through your walls, think of her, not as a legend, not as a patient, but as a companion in the art of resting. Let her story be a lullaby, not a lesson. Close your eyes. The bells are still ringing somewhere, slow and low and infinite. The world is still turning. And you, like Ellen, are allowed to let it turn without you for a while. You can rest now. The story has already learned how to keep going on its own.